On January 20th, Donald John Trump makes his triumphant return to the White House. Join us at 10:30 a.m. live from Washington, D.C. as we bring you the best coverage of an historic moment unlike any other. Special guests, inside information, insider trading.
Okay, maybe not. Nancy Pelosi and Elizabeth Warren said they aren't coming.
It's all here on the Tony Kinnett Cast. Tune in and watch the tears flow. Not ours, hers.
Could this year get any f***ing worse? Ruth!
Tony Kinnett.
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 Host of the Tony Kinnett Cast.
Let's get down to business.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WYPC.
WCYTV.
Here on the Daily Signal.
Well, can't say that I did not warn you that, boy, these confirmation hearings were going to be just something real special. Welcome to the Tony Kinnett Cast. I'm Tony Kinnett, coming to you live from a wonderful rural part of Indiana. And I say a wonderful rural part of Indiana for a couple of reasons. Number one, to establish that if you're listening to us or watching us on any of our syndication partners on radio or TV, howdy, I'm sorry that you also don't live in rural Indiana, the best place in this whole stinking country. Number two, so that I can clarify that there are so many Democratic senators who do not represent me, especially those that humiliated them and their constituents today on the floor of this Senate confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth, Trump, President-elect of the United States, his pick to be the next Secretary of Defense. And my, oh my, I knew going in that we were going to get an attempt at Brett Kavanaughing ever since Kamala Harris brought forward Christine Blasey Ford and she stuck her nose and her chin up in the air and said, Pete Hegseth, Brett Kavanaugh, he totally did things to me. I remember. I don't remember the date, the time, the place, and everyone else says it didn't happen who supposedly was there, but I promise it happened. You and I, we both knew. This was going to be the same thing for this confirmation hearing, because that's pretty much what the Senate is. For both the Republican and the Democrat Party, it is the last stop to kind of make your day-to-day argument to the American people why you could be America's next president or vice president. And right now, the Democrat bench is hurting. It's hurting for all kinds of things. It's hurting for talent. There's like way too few individuals who have any kind of competence on the Democrat side of the aisle to run for office. They're either setting their state on fire in California, literally like Gavin Newsom, or they're eating entire buffets and talking about illegal immigrants in Illinois, like Governor Pritzker, or doing weird kind of fetishistic communion videos with Doritos, like Gretchen Whitmer. So if you're a senator if the Democrat side of the aisle, this is the last great place. I mean, come on, the bar is so low. All you have to do is act sane here, and you blow past Senator Betterman out of Pennsylvania, and you're on your way to being the next DNC darling. So they stepped forward in droves today. And I remembered a few things. Number one, covering hearings is a lot longer than it sounds. Now, you and I think of a hearing the way that a lot of people would think of any kind of a meeting, whether it's at church, whether it's at school, whether it's at, your business. And a hearing sounds like something that may take like an hour or two. Oh, no. Au contraire, mon chéri. This is the kind of special, amazing, delightful, close to your heart kind of hearing that lasts all the ding-dong-dang day. And last all the ding-dong-dang day it did. For several hours, I sat in this studio in the morning, which I'm normally not in the morning, and I kicked up my feet, and I got out the popcorn. And in this case, actually, was some kettle potato chips. And because I am in Indiana, some Jack's Donuts. And after my breakfast, which was a lot more protein heavy instead of the carb fest that I snacked on during this Senate confirmation hearing, I got to watch the prima dem individuals try to make their case for why Pete Hegseth was a very, very, very stinky bad man who was not going to be the individual that would be confirmed as the next Secretary of Defense, because Republicans control the Senate. And so you were expecting some of this, but what you got right out of the gate were some primo shenanigans. So Hegseth, and what I thought was a very respectable move, he released his opening statement before the hearing began. I like this. I like this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it allows me to read the statement ahead of time and then focus on what I know is going to be a train wreck once the Senate confirmation hearing starts. Say, well, Tony, you're not clairvoyant. You're not a meteorologist. How can you predict the future? Well, I'll tell you how I can predict the future. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. The code pink Democrats, those that put Palestinian flags and pronouns in their bios, yeah, they're freaking insane. And because they're freaking insane people do freaking insane things. And I had a hunch right here, and also texts from our political editor and team down on the floor of this Senate confirmation hearing chamber, that there were some code pink people. We're talking like full-on vagina hat wearing individuals that were staffing the front row of this confirmation hearing. So if I was going to actually understand or read what was in Pete Hegseth's opening statement, I better get to it before all of the crazy starts happening. And happen it did. Because, boys and girls, 3 different times, nay, as Christ once said to Peter, before the cock will crow 3 times, you will see the Senate Democrats and their lovely protesters interrupt Pete Hegseth's opening statement. It's a very loose translation of scripture, but if you will forgive me the marring of the quotation of the King James, I'd like for you to hear who of the 3 was my favorite of the code pink protesters who was being escorted out. Now, let's do a little bit of a quiz here before we watch this. If you had to place a wager on what it is that someone in the confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth might protest about, what would it be? Might it be, you don't like that he's a Christian? You don't like that he's not really a huge fan of the LGBTQ stuff infesting the military? Maybe it's that he was associated with Fox News. What do you start standing up and screaming about? If you guessed Gaza, you are correct. Let's take a look at the definitely hinged individual. By the way, for those who are watching the live stream and you're not just listening via podcast or radio at the moment, if you see the guy in the pink blazer, the absolute champion who is looks like he bought most of his wardrobe at a Hot Topic in a party city, yeah, that's what the code pink people showed up wearing. Which I got to tell you, like weird anti-Semites throughout history, some of them at least knew how to dress. So if you're going to be some kind of a weird pseudo neo-Nazi, at least like dress in some Hugo Boss instead of what looks like you scalped the Pink Panther for. Just, pro tips out there for those of you fashion Nazis. Moving right along, we get to the opening. So you had Senator Wicker, I believe from Mississippi, get up and introduce the proceedings. And it's the first time that he's chaired this particular committee, so it's a kind of a slow start getting things going. And then Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island took the floor as the ranking Democrat member. And he, instead of just saying, hey, this is a, nonpartisan kind of a thing, we all have questions for the nominee, and then most of us end up confirming them because we confirmed people under the Trump administration, we confirmed people under the Obama administration, the Biden administration. That kind of stuff was sort of said, and that is what's usually said by the ranking member of the opposite party. But in this case, he just flat out makes it very clear that the Democrats despise Pete Hegseth, while, by the way, doing a very great job of looking like an old TV version of Dracula. So here's Jack Reed throwing precedent out the window like a goober right off the bat.
Mr. Hegseth, I do not believe that you are qualified to meet the overwhelming demands of this job. We must acknowledge the concerning public reports against you. A variety of sources, including your own writings, implicate you with disregarding the laws of war, financial mismanagement, racist and sexist remarks about men and women in uniform, alcohol abuse, sexual assault.
Okay, so the Democrats are already starting off the bat by doing this fun little tactic where they start off by saying, we have all of these public reports and also your own writings and all of this public stuff about things that you have done. And so they start listing out things. And they start off with things that, Pete Hegseth might actually have talked about at some time or things that are subjective. Then at the end, you hear him throw in sexual assault. None of the reports public, no public entity, no individual who has put their name, stamped it on the record, has accused Pete of sexual assault. There have been settlements that have been closed, but Hegseth and his team have been very clear right off the top of the bat that those are false allegations. And not to mention, the stories do not hold any kind of water whatsoever. And do you know one of the reasons that we know this? None of those statements were actually entered to the record of the committee, because every 5 seconds, while anyone was talking, like a Delta airline pilot when you're trying to watch a movie on the plane, they would cut in and say, I'd like to enter this piece of information into the record, and then no objections, and they'd all look down the row at each other back and forth. All right, great, it's entered into the record. No one entered this into the record once. It's going to come up with Hirono here in a moment or two, but believe me, we will get to Hirono and her whopping 3 IQ points. We'll let Jack the Bullfrog Reed continue jarbling for a few more seconds here.
Sexual harassment and other troubling issues. I have reviewed many of these allegations and find them extremely alarming. Indeed, the totality of your own writings and alleged conduct would disqualify any service member from holding any leadership position in the military, much less being confirmed as the Secretary of Defense.
That's also not true. As a fun fact, staff officers, flag officers, lots of sexual assault go on in the brass all the time. Everyone down to your E4 mafia knows about the sexual assault that occurs up at the brass. I mean, goodness gracious, the Pentagon has had more orgies over the last couple of decades than McDonald's has had fries. So, no. As much as I would love to champion our military's purity in this aspect, absolutely not. But, given that our commander-in-chief was once shoving a cigar in and out of private places of his intern, spare me.
Nonetheless, I understand that you reject many of these reports as they involve whistleblowers, non-disclosure agreements, and anonymous, although numerous, sources, including those who have faced political intimidation for sharing their experiences. I hope you will address each of these allegations thoroughly and truthfully during your testimony. Just as importantly, I hope you will pledge to prevent any repercussions for whistleblowers, both civilian and military.
The funny thing about that is that there actually haven't been any public whistleblowers out there about anything regarding Pete Hegseth and the serious allegations that Reed was talking about. Like, none. Now, there have been signed letters from those who were working with Pete Hegseth, both his time working with veterans organizations in Louisiana, and his time working with the Fox News Corporation, in working with Pete Hegseth in his time in the military, but not just in the military as members of the armed forces, but also members of foreign nations. Who Pete Hegseth worked with in working with local communities and in discussions and things like that. There's quite a substantial amount of evidence that was brought forward to say, Pete's a pretty decent guy. All of the rest of the stuff, we're looking for these individuals who have come out and have made these smears. And they are called smears because there's no one behind them. Anonymous allegations that are discordant with the rest of an individual's testimonies are called smears. They are called smears because they are directly meant to harm the character in the public eye of said person, without having the damning conviction that a lawsuit or that a public exposure with verified occurrences might have. So we get into the Democratic senator rigmarole. So we would have a Republican senator, and they would ask Pete Hegseth some questions. Now, just as a kind of a floor show for how this goes, the Republicans gave some softball questions, because, member of the party, a lot of them think that Pete Hegseth should just be forwarded right along up the chain because Pete's been in the public eye for a long time. What he believes is known, and a lot of them think that, Donald Trump should, in this case, get the nominations that he is looking for due to the struggles in the previous administration. And so some of the questions were simply confirmation of certain things that have been large cultural touch points over the last decade. Some of the questions, however, from Republican members were pretty tough. Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa actually asked some pretty tough questions and asked for a pledge about investigating sexual assault cases in the United States military from Pete Hegseth. And by the way, several Republican senators asked for Pete to pledge, his name to certain bills that they were looking to pass or certain programs, whether they be financial or whether they be the actual pedagogical application of those policies. And Pete said, well, I'm going to have to read it first. And then we had the Democratic senators. Now, there was one Democratic senator, the new one from Michigan, who started out for just a brief second. It looked like she was actually going to give a fair kind of argument. It's Alyssa Slotkin, a former CIA officer. It looked like she was going to start out pretty okay, and then she immediately went downhill. That was the best case. And we're going to walk through these because this truly is just some of the most egregious gaslighting and honestly, not even good theater when it comes to the Senate confirmation hearing. And just because, I like framing things out a little bit ahead of time, we're going to talk about the formula because the Democrats have a formula whenever it comes to any kind of a hearing anywhere. I have faced this formula when I've testified before state houses, all the way up to testifying before the United States Senate. You're going to get this formula. Here's how it goes. Step number one, the Democratic senator will ask a leading question. A leading question is one where the answer is baked into the question itself. A leading question, by the way, not allowed in most courts of law. This is usually where the objection leading the witness, that whole thing comes from. A leading question incriminates the person before they can even answer. So they ask a leading question so that no matter what the person who's being asked is going to say, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. So that's the first part. Then the nominee answers by not just answering directly the leading question, because then that would incriminate them either way they answered it, yes or no. So what they do is they provide context and they say, what you are asking is relative to this. Here's the background information. And if the background information starts to make the Democrat senator look really awful, then they cut them off at the pass and say, oh, you're not answering my question. I also only have 7 minutes of time, so we're going to move on. And that's how the political theater occurs. And a host of Democratic senators, whether we're talking about Gillibrand, Duckworth, Warren, King, Kaine, Peters, Illis, the new Slotkin from Michigan, these goobers are so transparent in the awkward formula of not asking real questions. And again, by the way, Republican senators, some of them asked softball questions. I gave them a little bit of grief as well. The Democrat senators were just morally atrocious. And amazingly, though, because everyone is just, unique and different, they had their own little ways of being particularly awful human beings. We're going to get into that. Off the bat, we've got Kirsten Gillibrand. And Gillibrand from New York, she's something special because she started off by griping at Pete Hegseth over his perceived that he didn't think that women, should be in combat intensive roles because in combat there are several different roles that occur. And so when you're talking about a role in combat, that doesn't directly identify what role in combat one is going to have. So Pete Hegseth has said clearly, I don't think that the average woman can hold up to the physical standards that combat would incur when you think about the weight of the rucksack and you actually think about the intense, stressful conditions. And so therefore, if a woman meets the standards, we can talk about it. Otherwise, if the standards are not able to be met, then no, I don't think that's a very good way to run the United States military. Our forces should be lethal. Gillibrand just lost her ever-loving mind and sounded like she was winding, like a toy that was getting ready to explode. Just started talking faster and louder and more shrilly. And it was really quite something to behold. So here's Gillibrand just, being Gillibrand.
You've denigrated active duty service members. We have hundreds of women who are currently in the infantry, lethal members of our military serving in the infantry, but you degrade them. You say, we need moms, but not in the military, especially in combat units. So specific to Senator Cotton's question, because Senator Cotton was giving you layups to differentiate between different types of combat.
As much as I love to gripe at Republicans over giving layup questions to Trump appointees, the questions that Senator Cotton was actually giving Hegseth were not layups. He asked very directly, are you against women serving in the military? Hegseth said no. And he said, are you against women who meet standards of combat readiness serving in those roles? And he said, no. So that actually cuts the issue off. Democrats then can't do anything with that because he stated on the record right here in the Senate confirmation hearing, no. Well, she can't accept that. So she's, well, are you against moms? By the way, and to make this perfectly clear, if you are a mom of a young child, no, you shouldn't be serving in a combat role. What's wrong with you? Go home and be with your kid. By the way, and to make this expressly clear, this is one of the reasons why in a combat role position that bachelors are preferred to married men, because a man has a responsibility who is married to take care of his wife and his kids. And why, of course, obviously, we are thankful for the thousands of married men and fathers who are off performing combat roles in a value to value ratio. An individual who is a bachelor or a single individual is the most valuable because if they die in combat, they do not leave behind a series of wards. This is basic common sense, but she's got some freaking out to do.
And specifically, as secretary, would you take any action to reinstitute the combat arms exclusion for female service members, knowing full well you have hundreds of women doing that job right now? And the standards, your 2 mile run, Tom, is about the Army Combat Fitness Test. It is not the requirements to have an MOS 11 Bravo, which is the infantry.
By the way, just as a fun little aside here, if you need to explain that 11 Bravo, the MOS tag means infantry, you really should not be on the Armed Services Committee. You shouldn't be. That's laughable. But anywho, I remember completing at West Point the cadet fitness assessment, and there was a fat girl that, I kid you not, finished her 2 mile run. Are you ready for this? 22 minutes for a 2 mile run. It was like formal speed walking out there. I remember very clearly. It was insane because there was one kid who finished ahead of all of us and then continued to run like a psycho. He was awesome. Don't know whatever happened to him, but that dude could run. And then there were the middle of the Packers. And then there were the stragglers who came in. And then well after the allotted time was the equity appointment. And so this is Gillibrand freaking out because, again, Hegseth is pointing out quite clearly that, standards matter.
Are the requirements today for people serving in the industry, men and women? They are gender neutral and they are very difficult to meet. They have not been reduced in any way.
They have.
And our combat units, our infantry is lethal. So please explain specifically. That's not a binary term. You will be in charge of 3 million personnel. It is a big job. And when you make these public statements, and I get you were not Secretary of Defense then, I get you were on TV, I get you were helping veterans, I get it was a different job. But most recently, you said this in November of 2024, knowing full well you might have been named as Secretary of Defense.
Her voice cracks just because she does this the entire time. Just, again, accusation. You said this, therefore you must mean this. It's classic theater. Didn't want any answers. And then you had Duckworth, who was sitting in for another senator who was supposed to be there. Actually, Rosen ended up coming in later and giving her own display of stupidity we're not going to dig into. But Duckworth slides in and does the same kind of just goofy-footed nonsense.
Have you led an audit of any organization? Yes or no? I don't want a long answer. Yes or no? Have you led an audit of any organization of which you were in charge?
Senator, in both of the organizations I ran, we were always completely fiscally responsible.
Yes or no? Did you lead an audit?
And the way
yes or no? Did you lead an audit? Yes or no? What are you afraid of? You can't answer this question.
Okay, so let's talk about audits for a second. First of all, ladies, boys, girls, and squirrels, did you know that the CEO and the president of an organization isn't the one who leads an audit? I know, it's kind of incredible. Now, this is basically, this isn't even something that's taught in business school. This is just something that is a common understanding that usually it is a business's accounting firm that they hire, or a legal team that hires an accountant that performs an audit. And there are several kinds of audits. So she's like, you've criticized how the Pentagon is spending its money, so have you ever performed an audit? I'm sorry, I can't think of a single CO or an XO that I've ever known that has performed an audit of their unit. What are you talking about? But again, you know, Duckworth, she's had service, so she gets to say whatever she wants about the military, and no one can criticize anything that she says, even though I'm pretty sure that when it actually comes to intelligence, she left that out on the range. But anyway, here, Duckworth's gonna, again, continue to get upset because he hasn't performed an audit. Like it's a course you gotta complete at Cornell.
Yes or no, did you lead an audit? Do you not know this answer?
Senator, every part of my leadership of these organizations has been misrepresented.
I will take that as a no. What were the findings? So there were no findings because you've never led an audit. What guidance did you give the auditors? None, because you've never led an audit. Nobody expects you to be an accountant, Mr. Hegseth. What we expect is for you to understand the complexity of this Pentagon budget process that is.
I love that. That's so fantastic. We don't expect you to be an accountant, but did you do the things an accountant did? Did you do the things an accountant did? We don't expect you to be an accountant, but also that's what my question is asking. So when he tries to provide context and say, well, yeah, I actually advised on financial matters and audits in regard to the veterans organizations that I was in charge of, and she didn't want that answer. They want the yes or no so they can say, well, if you haven't done an audit and you're also not an official public notary, how can you lead the Department of Defense in its holy greatness? And that was, you know, pretty much Tammy Duckworth, but that's kind of par for the course for her. Elizabeth Warren looked as though you took a Yorkshire Terrier and you gave it a latte and then you just shook it like back and forth and then set it on the table and said, all right, go. That was Elizabeth Warren. So when she isn't faking being a Native American, she's throwing very weird, wild stuff out. So this is what Pete Hegseth had to sit through with Pocahontas the Great.
In other words, you're quite sure that every general who serves should not go directly into the defense industry for 10 years. You're not willing to make that same pledge?
I'm not a general, Senator.
You'll be the one.
So let's talk about that for a second. So Warren mentions a law in the books in which generals would not be, or excuse me, a law that proposed that generals would not be allowed to go into the defense industry like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, etc., for a number of years after they were generals, so that therefore you theoretically would not have as easy a time for defense industry organizations to lobby certain practices by offering really sweet jobs right as soon as a general retires. So Warren says, well, what about that for you? And Hegseth said, well, the bill is for general. This is specifically for generals who are currently serving actively in the military. The Secretary of Defense is a civilian role. It's supposed to be. They are a civilian role. Very specific difference there. And she, again, loses her mind. He's like, well, you know, I'm not like a general, correct? And of course, everyone laughs at her because Elizabeth Warren and Nancy Pelosi, who usually spend their time messing around with insider trading in Congress anyway, very curious that she's suddenly very passionate about that. I'm not going to play any clips of independent Angus King, who sat with the Democrats, but he looked as though he was going to die the entire night. If I can give you an idea of what I think Angus King looks like, I want you to mix in your mind John Bolton and the old Q, quartermaster from the James Bond films, but like 1/3 as intelligent. And I honestly think that maybe he has a great career ahead of him in selling balloons outside the zoo, or maybe being a cobbler, or possibly working at an old-timey ice cream shop. But he slept almost through Warren's testimony, or it really was more of a testimony than a cross-examination. That brings us over to Tim Kaine. Now, when I said that everyone had their own particular brand of insanity that they brought to the table on the Democrat side of the aisle to this particular nomination hearing, Tim Kaine, Hillary Clinton's vice presidential pick, the senator from Virginia, he just got really, really creepy. So his hair is all up. His glasses are sort of kind of on his head. And he's got this really weird predatory look in his eye. And when I say he has a weird predatory look in his eye, it is beautifully complemented with the fact that the man started talking about Pete Hegseth's children, in detail. And he had this weird, hunched over, creepy look. Imagine how Disney would paint the guy that Chris Hansen's about to talk to. That's what Tim Kaine was giving off here. Check it out for yourself. This is one of the creepier things I've sat through in a hearing.
Completely cleared. Can you so casually cheat on a second wife and cheat on the mother of a child that had been born 2 months before, and you tell us you are completely cleared? How is that a complete clear?
Senator, her child's name is Gwendolyn Hope Hegseth, and she's a child of God, and she's 7 years old.
And she was, and
here.
you cheated on the mother of that child less than 2 months after that daughter was born, didn't you?
Those were false charges.
Well,
it was fully investigated, and I was completely cleared.
So the Democrat Senate got really aggravated whenever Hegseth said those are false charges. It was investigated. It was cleared. And Kaine just got in a complete absolute tizzy. So he started off his entire questioning of Hegseth, as many of them do, not with questions, but by talking about his family, and then saying, "Yeah, and you cheated on her, didn't you?" And it's okay, creepy sergeant from Braveheart, the really creepy one who's really thrilled at seeing Prima Nocta carried out. You know the one I'm talking about if you've seen Braveheart. No, that was an allegation that was made. There was a court case that was carried out, and that was a false smear. No evidence entered into the record actually suggests what it is that you're accusing me of right now. So if you'd like to ask me about things that are on the record, by all means, go ahead. And Kaine just sits on this. It's really creepy stuff for a long time. It is quite odd that Tim Kaine is really concerned, because he goes on talking about how somebody that cheats on their wife, they have no business being the Secretary of Defense. Tim Kaine spent the entire campaign of Hillary Clinton's on stage with Bill Clinton, who shoved a cigar into the orifices of interns at the White House and traveled to Epstein Island, of where there is a portrait of Bill Clinton in a dress, or was a portrait of Bill Clinton in a dress on said island, 26 times. So just kind of a hunt. Before you get high and mighty with us about the wonderful rules of marriage and fidelity and the eternity of decisions making you unqualified for office or friendship and all of that stuff like that, just saying, you're not exactly the Democrat that I would put up to preach that kind of virtue. So aside from the weird creepiness of Jabba the Cane from Virginia, then you had two semi-competent Democrats who really tried. And this is where we're going to get back into kind of the argument, the one argument against Pete Hegseth, really, which is that you've never commanded a massive organization before. And because you've never commanded an entire company, which, by the way, people are very unsatisfied by the polling data with kind of the CEO elite internal mindset of federal bureaucracy, that because he doesn't fit that role, he's not qualified for the position. And then Senator Wicker, by the way, right afterward, smacks that down, rightfully so, actually fulfilling his role of chairman of the committee. So anyway, here's Senator Gary Peters from Michigan claiming that Hegseth is not at all qualified because he's only ever led organizations that didn't have 3 million people associated with them, or something, at least. That's what he apparently trying to communicate.
It's for the Secretary of Defense that we have someone who has never managed an organization more than 100 people is going to come in and manage this incredibly important organization and do it with a professionalism and has no experience that they can tell us that they have actually done that? I have real problems with that you're able to take on this tremendous responsibility with a complex organization and having little or no significant management experience.
Senator, I'm grateful to be hired by one of the most successful CEOs in American history, should I be confirmed.
Mr. Hegseth, it seems to me that you've supervised far more people than the average United States senator supervises typically.
And the reason that that's hilarious is, again, yes, whenever you look at the senators who start talking about the virtues of the United States government and how hallowed its halls and how experienced and technocratic we must be in assigning these denizens of moral and academic wonder to its ivory and alabaster halls, some of these you do realize that John Fetterman looks like an AC mechanic that's about to tell you the cat died in there and he's going to have to charge a $250 to replace it. Like, Dianne Feinstein sat in there doing her best imitation of a potato that was left far too long at the bottom of the pantry for ages. Half of them look like mannequins. Most of them have very little experience whatsoever as far as the massive organizational leadership structure. Oh, how grand and amazing. Nobody had that complaint when Pete Buttigieg, whose entire series of qualifications to be the Secretary of Transportation came to, he once complained about the potholes as the mayor of South Bend, which, by the way, being mayor of South Bend, in a city that is that small, I wouldn't personally be bragging. It's like one of Indiana's only towns of size that, isn't directly linked via interstate with Indianapolis. But number two, and my most personal favorite of his qualifications, is that he likes trains. So, no, none of that. Just for Pete Hegseth. Only for Republicans, we must have high standards. But, if you have, Secretary Lloyd Austin, or Mayorkas, or that weird dude in a skirt, Rachel Levine, they're perfectly qualified for everything. Give them all of the things and lots of hugs and kisses. By the way, I do want to pop the bubble on this organizational thing. You guys do realize that in a company or an organization, you have middle managers. So you don't just have 3 million people reporting to you. This was solved in the book of Exodus, boys and girls. So what you do is you set up leaders. And so when the private's got a question, if he's stupid, he asks the sergeant. And then the sergeant, after smacking the private for being stupid, he might then report to the officer. And realistically, the lieutenant should be listening to the sergeant too, but for this sake, you've got, the lieutenant. And the lieutenant might report to a captain or a major, who then reports to the old man, who reports to the bird, the colonel. And then the colonels report to the generals. And then some of the lower generals report to the general staff in Washington, D.C., who then report up the line until you get to the chiefs of staff, the deputy secretary of defense, and the secretary of defense. It's amazing. Wow. We have like this whole structure. So no, the secretary of defense is not answering calls every day from 3 million people. He's answering to a direct number of individuals that are right below him. That he can, by the way, you realize that he, and has said this on the record, he can hire people who, I know this is going to sound kind of crazy, who know more about that field than he does. When I ran Chalkboard Review, I tried to appoint individuals to positions below me that knew more about, for example, editing than I did. That way I didn't have to worry about it, and I just held them to that standard of what was good for editing. This idea that a CEO has to know how everything in the company works down to the first screw is stupid. That's not how anything works at all. And if you think that's how multi-level national business works, it's time to shut off Bluey and time to take a look at what's actually going on out here. And for that record, I don't really have an issue with Pete Buttigieg per se as an individual who is a mayor being made the secretary of something. If he is good at what he does and he has people under him who are decent at their jobs, I care that the system works. But being mad at Pete Hegseth because he hasn't commanded Apple is hilarious. So that about wraps up most of the Democrat goofiness. Oh, don't worry, I haven't forgotten. Last but certainly not least was Mazie Hirono. So I did go a little out of order here. Mazie Hirono was my prediction to be the most off-the-wall idiot at the confirmation hearings, and I will be collecting that bet from those I made it with. Mazie Hirono, whose I believe total IQ is 6 or 7 on a good day, she just went full-on gaslighting, junior high girl accusing some guy she doesn't like of being Satan incarnate. So first of all, Mazie Hirono started going off on Pete. Well, she went off on Pete Hegseth the entire time, but she started yelling at him about being drunk at work. Again, anonymous reports, which individuals at Fox News and other organizations have come out and said, I don't know where you're getting this, but like these reports are anonymous for a reason. So here's Mazie Hirono, though, doubling, tripling down. She's going to go for the gold here.
I have read multiple reports of your regularly being drunk at work, including by people who worked with you at Fox News. Do you know that being drunk at work is prohibited for service members under the UCMJ?
Senator, those
Yes
are
or no?
multiple false anonymous reports peddled by NBC
Do you
News
know
that
that
run directly
drinking on the job
contradictory to
is
the dozens of men and women at
not
Fox News
contemplated
Channel
I'm
who
not
I work
hearing-
with
I'm
who
not
came
hearing
on
the
the
answer to my
record
question.
and said they've
In your
never
opening
seen
statement,
that.
Mr. Hegseth, you commit to holding leaders accountable at all levels. That includes you, of course. And frankly, as Secretary...
It includes... Okay, grow up, ma'am. This is the United States Senate, and if you're going to ask questions, you're going to get answers. If you don't like the answer to that question, laughing as though you've just stepped into a puddle of water in your socks is not behooving of a United States Senator. The idea that if you don't want answers, you just want to like lecture him, just lecture him. You don't have to ask him any questions. Like just griping at him over and over and over isn't really helping anybody. But I mean, sorry, who am I to interrupt the great senator from Hawaii?
You will be on the job 24/7. You recently promised some of my Republican colleagues that you stopped drinking and won't drink if confirmed, correct?
Absolutely.
So he answers some questions. He tries to kind of make it, very clear. This is what is going on. She doesn't hear a word of it. Then, as if she was not already off the rails, she hops a totally different track and then gets off of those rails and starts accusing Hegseth of wanting to shoot protesters in the legs. You got to hear this one for yourself, folks.
Senator, on multiple occasions, including as a young second lieutenant, I have sworn an oath to the Constitution,
yes.
and I'm proud to do so. Yes, ma'am.
Answer is yes.
In June of 2020, then President Trump directed former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to shoot protesters in the legs in downtown D.C.
That is not true. Just for the record, that has been 100% debunked. That is a hilarious accusation. But then again, false premise set up. Now she can follow the formula.
An order Secretary Esper refused to comply with. Would you carry out such an order from President Trump?
Senator, I was in the Washington, D.C. National Guard unit that was in Lafayette Square during those
Would you
events,
carry
holding
out
a
an
riot
order to
shield on
shoot
behalf of my
protesters
country.
in the legs?
I saw 50
as
Secret
directed
Service agents
to
get injured
Secretary
by
Esper?
rioters trying to jump over the fence, set
Again,
the church on fire, and destroy
You know
a
what?
statue.
That sounds to me that you will
Chaos.
comply with such an order. You will shoot protesters in the leg.
That is a wildly disgusting thing to accuse a veteran of. That's disgusting. So to answer her question, he said, look, I was there. I can do one better than just tell you about orders. I can tell you what I saw when I was there. This was my service. This is where I was at. This is what I was doing. This was my active role in the situation. And she just lectures over him and then says, I think you would shoot him in the leg. I think you would. I think you'd shoot everyone in the legs, babies. Tables and chairs, everyone. Again, I do not think that you could write an individual in fiction who is this loony. Not even Bugs would share a screen with this Looney Tune. The best part, though, is when she suggests that Hegseth is all ready to militarily invade Panama and Greenland. This is, man, I tell you, when it comes to electing bad people, nobody does it quite like Hawaii.
Would you use our military to take over Greenland or an ally of Denmark?
Senator, one of the things that President Trump is so good at is never strategically tipping his hand. And so I would never in this public forum give one way or another direct what orders the president would give me in any context.
That sounds to me that you would contemplate carrying out such an order to basically invade Greenland and take over the Panama Canal.
That's a real person. That's a real parents. I guess raised that. That's a real person who has been elected to the United States Senate. I have producers for the show. And producers for the show, whether that's Allison, who operates the board and then transmits the signal from WIBC to the other affiliate radio stations, does a phenomenal job doing the board operation. Whether that's Daniel Elmore, who is an amazing marketing producer and kind of show content production guy. Whether we're talking about Louis Cataglia out in Pennsylvania, one of the best booking producers I've ever seen. Great staff, excellent team. If any of those individuals started making decisions on behalf of the show and what I wanted to do with the show, like big decisions, I'd be a little bit miffed. Because this show is the work that I do at the present time. And so therefore, I'm the one making the decisions, not them on the big stuff. Now, I may assign them responsibilities to make decisions. So when Hirono's asking him, are you going to, invade Greenland and Panama? He's like, that's not my call to make. Donald Trump has made it extremely clear. The biggest failure in the Obama administration and the Biden administration in foreign policy, other than having no idea how the Middle East works at all, is always telegraphing their hand so that anytime the United States retaliated, the individuals who committed the atrocities against the United States get away. Countries don't take us seriously. We end up sacrificing men and women both in our own services as well as of other countries who are allies. And Trump has said, I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. You're just going to have to speculate. Whether you think that I'm going to march into Greenland, if that's where you really want to speculate on, you go right ahead. I'm not showing anyone my hand. She won't accept that answer. And so she just takes a big old swig of whiskey right there. I guess that kind of violates her no alcoholics rule. Speaking of alcoholics rule, though, I do want to tell you a little bit about Senator Mullen's response. So Senator Mullen, the Republican of Oklahoma, easily takes home the MVP award for the day. And he does this by just ripping to shreds the Democrat, bait and switch leading question strategy there in front of the entire country. And it is, I'm really just going to play the entire exchange for you because it is beautiful from start to finish.
There's a lot of talk going about talking about qualifications and then about us hiring him if we are the board. But there's a lot of senators here I wouldn't have on my board because there is no qualifications except your age, and you got to be living in the state and you're a citizen of the United States to be a senator. Other than the fact we got to convince a lot of people to vote for us. And then when we start talking about qualifications for if you're qualified for it, could the chairman tell me what the qualifications are for the Secretary of Defense? Mr. Chairman, could you tell me what the qualifications are for the Secretary of Defense?
I'd be happy
I'll read it.
For you to do that. Yeah.
Let me read it for you because I Googled
I was getting some advice from my second in command.
Yeah, but I'm just making a point because there's a lot about qualifications. And I think it's so hypocritical of senators, especially on the other side of the aisle, be talking about his qualifications, not being able to lead the secretary or be the Secretary of Defense, and yet your qualifications aren't any better. You guys aren't any more qualified to be the senator than I'm qualified to be the senator, except we're lucky enough to be here. But let me read you what the qualifications of the Secretary of Defense is, because I Googled it, and went through a lot of different sites, and really it's hard to see. But in general, the U.S. Secretary of Defense position is filled by a civilian. That's it. If you have served in the U.S. Army Forces and have been in the service for, you have to be retired for at least 7 years, and Congress can weigh that. And then there's questions that the senator from Massachusetts brought up about serving on a board inside the military industry, and yet your own secretary that you all voted for, Secretary Austin, we had to vote on a waiver because he stepped off the board of Raytheon. But I guess that's okay because that's a Democrat Secretary of Defense. But we so quickly forget about that. And then Senator Kaine, or I guess I better use the senator from Virginia, starts bringing up the fact that what if you showed up drunk to your job? How many senators have showed up drunk to vote at night?
Oh.
Have any of you guys asked them to step down and resign from their job?
By the way, there are like live on the floor cocktail parties in which senators do like just bring in drinks to the floors of Congress. So, boy, man, I tell you what, Mullen is really just bringing the unfathomable heat.
And don't tell me you haven't seen it, because I know you have. And then how many senators do you know have got a divorce before cheating on their wives? Did you ask them to step down? No. But it's for show. You guys make sure you make a big show and point out the hypocrisy because the man's made a mistake. And you want to sit there and say that he's not qualified? Give me a joke. I mean, it is so ridiculous that you guys hold yourself as this higher standard and you forget you got a big plank in your eye. We've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes. And Jennifer, thank you for loving him through that mistake.
So it really is it was quite a show on the floors of this particular Senate confirmation hearing. Because first of all, this was going to be the big one with the most fireworks. Kennedy's is definitely going to have some big stuff going on. That's going to be tomorrow. I'm looking forward also to Kristi Noem's. I'm looking forward as well to Tulsi Gabbard's. That's going to be one that's going to be for the books. Because really, we are just, at this point, if we are going to have a circus, then it might as well be an entertaining one. And if you would have told me that it was going to be the Republican Party that started pulling out of the circus and starting the getting back to work process as quickly as they have, a couple of years ago, I'm not really sure I would have believed you. Now, I am going to have to eat my own words on that right away a little bit because Jasmine Crockett and Nancy Mace almost threw hands in the House today. But before we get to that, before we get over, we're actually going to head over to Stephen Kent here in just a minute to talk about a little Watchin, as well as a little something that I made from thoughts on Gillibrand's ramblings and yellings today. I do want to point out, I misspoke. Bill Clinton's signature on the Jeffrey Epstein Island guest book, wild that kind of a place had a guest book. Bill Clinton's signature on the guest book was found on the island, and his portrait owned by Epstein was in Epstein's apartment in Manhattan. So I want to be clear there, unlike some senators who, just run right past it and then pretend that they never said what they just awkwardly said on the floor of the Senate confirmation hearing. We'll be back in a second to talk with Stephen Kent, and then afterward, we'll talk a little bit about Biden and the SEC suing Elon Musk and FEMA possibly kicking some people out of their hotel rooms in North Carolina. It's the Tony Kennett Cast here on the Daily Signal.
This is the Tony Kennett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Welcome back to the Tony Kennett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated first on 93 WIBC. It's Tuesday, which means we're going to get back into the swing of things with a little Watcha Watchin with Stephen Kent from the Consumer Choice Center. So, Stephen, right off the top, what you watching?
Well, I know I'm supposed to be watching entertaining shows and wonderful programs on HBO and Showtime, but I've just been a
little bit of culture.
I've been really distracted by the high culture of C-SPAN here today, watching those hearings, man. It's top-notch entertainment. HBO's got nothing on Mazie Hirono telling Pete Hegseth he's going to shoot protesters in the leg. You can't make this stuff up.
This was the best hearing. First of all, nomination hearings are worth watching anyway, especially in today's day and age. Remember Kamala Harris losing her mind and squawking like the chicken from Moana at Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court nomination hearing. Well, now it's time for the Pete Hegseth, and that's just the first one. And I got to tell you, Hirono was awful. I was expecting Hirono to be the worst, actually. I do get to collect a bet from a friend that I said Hirono was going to be the worst. But I'll tell you, man, I was not expecting Gillibrand to just be like the screeching and screaming like the kid from the Wild Thornberries. You remember?
Oh my God, bro.
I mean, I was going to say Gollum every time he loses control of the ring in Lord of the Rings.
Dude, she aged 30 years in 2 weeks. What happened?
Power. It's just power. Have you ever seen the way Emperor Palpatine is just declining in Star Wars? You know, it's something like that. It's the power of the dark side.
But there was another Senate seat conceived. Okay.
It's pretty rough for these people.
Well, that was brutal. So as someone who really enjoys just, you know, you have the Republican senators and they're all like, mwah, mwah, you're wonderful, mwah, mwah, mwah. And then, you know, followed up by the Democrats, which are saying, so how long has it been since you've stopped beating your wife? We used to criticize Hollywood for not writing things like things occur in real life. I got to tell you, real life has let me down on the writing standards over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, these people have all this time to get prepared for these hearings. And then you have Senator like John Kelly, who just kind of comes in there and he just, not John Kelly,
Mark Kelly, yeah.
Mark Kelly. He just comes in there with the most lazy, unimpressive questions. And Mazie Hirono sounds like she's coming up with them on the spot. And she's not even convincing. Some of these senators, when they're doing the attack dog routine or the suck up routine, it seems like they put a lot of work into it. And then you just got these people who just clearly stumbled in, still hungover from the night before, like Tim Kaine, by the way, and asking these questions.
As a guy who loves to do voice acting, whenever I relay someone's words back, especially on a broadcast, I have a desire it's very natural to imitate the voices. And I am concerned that if I try to quote Senator Hirono or Senator Tammy Duckworth, then I am accidentally going to fall into perhaps a stereotypical Asian accent, and I'm going to be canceled by 9 p.m. So I've thought about the crazy language going back and forth there on the Senate committee hearings and things like that. Do you think that these things need a commercial break, like major sporting events, just so we can get like a little bit of a breather?
Well, I think WIBC Indiana should give you as much rope as you need to do highly offensive things on air.
Yeah, enough of a rope to hang myself with a joke like that. Yikes.
Yeah, but you know, these hearings will continue. There are some bigger ones on the way. The RFK hearing for Kennedy Jr. is going to be a knockdown, drag out, super, super weird and awkward, honestly, for everybody. And these kind of suck up routines for Republicans, for Republican nominees, I don't think we're going to be seeing that so much when it comes to Tulsi Gabbard and RFK. I mean, these are going to be very strange hearings that I think are going to surprise everybody how they go down. There's really no way to predict what's going to happen with Republicans trying to confirm 2 lifelong Democrats.
So given that we could dig into the politics and spend the rest of our time talking about the intricacies of nomination hearings, I had come to you with a bit of a dilemma. I feel like I've watched everything. And you being our Watchin guy, you have to have something right now that doesn't make me want to stab my ears with scissors, because my wife watches new sitcoms. And the latest sitcom that she's been watching feels like every other sitcom of its genre. So what do you got for me that isn't going to make me want to throw a chair through a plate glass window?
Yeah, so over on Paramount Plus, because Paramount distributes Showtime shows, there are 2 shows that caught my interest that I wanted to check out, both of them. The first one I'm going to caution against, Landman, starring Billy Shoot. Oh no.
See, this is what happens. That kind of impromptu stuff, you're gonna get into.
You're gonna have to Billy Bob Thornton. Landman, starring Billy Bob Thornton and John Hamm. So this show is about the oil drilling business. It's definitely in the Taylor Sheridan, like Yellowstone cinematic universe. But Tony, it's just real garbage. It's really, really sleazy. It's kind of an ugly show in the way that the very beginning of Yellowstone was just way oversexed, raunchy, and not something that you could watch with a clean conscience. I really don't recommend it. It really blew its opportunity. But what I do recommend is hopping over to Showtime and watching The Agency, starring Michael Fassbender and Richard Gere. Richard Gere is still out there doing things.
Okay, so you've got me hooked on the actors. You got me hooked on the name of the show. I haven't heard much about it. I'm guessing the agency. What kind of agency are we talking about here?
We're talking about the CIA.
Okay, I'm very invested.
Yeah.
Continue. Sell me on the agency.
Well, CIA shows are relatively cookie cutter. There will be drama. There will be spy games. This is, of course, a relationship drama where you've got Michael Fassbender, who is in a relationship with like a Sudanese political activist who is caught in between her country negotiating with China for the Belt and Road Initiative that is going to make China the new imperial, controller of Africa, and she's caught between Western powers who would like to see her working for their interest. And so Michael Fassbender's in a love relationship with her. It's bad for everybody. It's tough. You got Chinese spies. You've got Russia spies. It's really cool. It's a really, really good show, well performed. Richard Gere is the station chief for the CIA in London. And it's a really, really fantastic performance. I would highly recommend this show. It does get off to a slow start, like most CIA intelligence shows. But man, once it picks up, and you cannot get off the ride.
I'm into those kind of shows that do have kind of an escalating bit of drama in the context of what the show is about. I think White Collar did that really well. When you weren't struggling through all of the Ford advertisements that were ham-fisted into every single episode. Mm-hmm. But I'm worried that we're running out of good shows because there's very little creativity I feel, I guess, as though there's very little creativity that's being brought into how shows are written. And I'm concerned that if what we're seeing is a bunch of streaming services throw out the same old garbage, new sitcoms that stay on for 2 seasons and fall off, have streaming services just become cable all over again?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the costs are all added up to, still push people well over $100, $120 a year when you net together all of your different services. So yeah, it absolutely is the new cable, but you got to just do more digging. You got to search for more diamonds in the rough, watch more pilots of shows. And look, it's the same rule as wasting your life on a bad book. If you get 20, 30 pages into a book and you don't like it, you need to stop, bail out, watch something else. And, that's exactly what we did with Landman, because we love Taylor Sheridan shows on Paramount and everything that he has done post Yellowstone. But, it was just a really trashy show, with a really bad message about dads raising daughters and parenting. It was an ugly program. So we just turned it off and we were watching The Agency instead. And it's good.
I like that idea because sometimes you get into this wind up where I have to finish the show. I have to see what happened. No, you don't. It's not worth sticking around and watching. And I think that might be the one point of contention that I have with people on some of these shows and movies, where if it's just not good, I don't care what happens to whoever it is. Just shut it off. It's not worth it. I'll just watch the Strong Bad Emails from Homestar Runner again. It's just not worth it.
Yep. That's right. And, we have been in a TV desert. My wife and I are also going through Game of Thrones again. We haven't watched it since it aired. And, when it's been over 10 years or a little bit under 10 years
since
the show aired. Yeah, I do think it ages well. And also you forget what happened. You remember the broad strokes of a show. You remember the kingdoms, you remember the kings, but you really forget a lot of the small interpersonal dramas that happen in a show that went on for that long. So watching Game of Thrones after 8 years, it's like watching it for the first time, except when you go back over it a second time, you actually remember people's names and it begins to stick in a way that it didn't the first time when you watch. So we're on season 7, which is when Game of Thrones started going back up in quality again before the eventual plummet.
Right.
So it's a good time.
Have you seen Inside Out 2?
Oh boy, for the first time, watched it last week and it hits hard.
In a good way, because I've seen two things. I've seen people saying, like the meta commentary, that, they talked about anxiety. That's so wonderful. And then I've seen people griping at each other over predictions they made before the movie. I haven't seen anyone say like, yeah, it was funny. It was good. It was bad. What? Tell me.
Yeah, it was funny and it was good, and it wasn't as good as Inside Out 1, which, as a message, that movie is about nostalgia and it's about kids having to deal with their childhood memories, eventually kind of becoming points sadness. And I think adults, that movie hits them like a sledgehammer when they realize that their happy childhood memories, their nostalgia, does enter the category of being a sad memory in a way. It's a sort of mourning as you grow older. The second movie is dealing with Riley, the main character, growing up and becoming a teenager. And what she is going through in that time period is the introduction of anxiety to her life. And
right.
I know why conservatives are sort of angry about that, because anxiety has sort of become this sacred totem of the left as like a natural and good thing that we should always talk about. So we don't want to celebrate it. But anxiety is real when you're 13, 14 years old. And it comes out of nowhere.
It was just weird to me that it became the sole focus. I know that's the new character introduced, but the glowing terms it was talked about, I was like, okay, great.
Well, something that the hype didn't fully explain was that, the anxiety emotion enters, and it does actually present itself as a villain in the beginning of the movie. It takes over the control room of Inside Out in like a hostile takeover, and is presented as a very bad character. But as you sort of get to know the anxiety emotion, you realize like it does not have a grasp on reality. And if Disney were pushing the leftist message about anxiety, it would say that anxiety's view of the world is true. And what this movie actually says is that anxiety's view of the world is not true and is bad for the main character, which is good. That is what we want that to say.
See, I don't know. I think that part of that, there's a curious thing you get as kind of a gamble with Pixar, where it's not often that Pixar has a sequel that is better than the original. I think Toy Story, the sequel, is better than the original. But as far as the rest of them, Incredibles felt a little bit short. Or fell a little bit short, and I don't know. I'll see if I'll hold my judgment, but I'll watch it for sure.
I think you should check it out, and everybody should give it a fair spin.
You got it. Stephen Kent, Consumer Choice Center. Another great week of What You Watchin'. Thanks very much, man.
Thank you.
We'll be back soon. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal.
It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Man, that was one serious first segment for the Quick News Roundup. I didn't realize while we were going through it that ended up being like 40 minutes long. But you know what? Sometimes things are worth it. To see Mazie Hirono just acting like Mazie Hirono is just something in and of itself entirely. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, whether you're joining us over on the live streams on X and Twitter, whether you're joining us on one of the radio or TV affiliates or on the podcast. It's good to be with you because there is just a bit more going on around the world than the Senate confirmation hearing with Pete Hegseth. First and foremost would be President Biden's SEC is now suing Elon Musk over its Twitter acquisition just days before Gensler and Biden are out of here. Now, it is worth noting two things here. First of all, the SEC is suggesting that Elon Musk did not notify them early enough about the shares that he did or didn't have. We're talking like this is the thinnest case in history, and it is all going to boil down to that Biden and his entire administration and the Democrats in general despise Elon Musk for being a billionaire that does not agree with him. And, if you're a billionaire who agrees with him, you get the Presidential Medal of Super Duper Freedom, and you're allowed to buy all of the radio stations just like that. That's totally fine. But the minute Elon Musk has enough shares of Twitter, the same a company that the government colluded with in order to suppress information about the son of the President of the United States, that kind of stuff. COVID-19, a whole other mess of nonsense. That's too far. How dare you actually act against our general wishes? This has been on Biden's to-do list, other than eat okra, ice cream, and not die, for quite some time. Here is Biden 2 years ago, basically telegraphing that he was going to do this anyway.
I think that Elon Musk's cooperation and/or technical relationships with other countries is worthy of being looked at.
Man, even Biden 2 years ago was just struggling up a storm. It's 22 seconds in, and the man has said a whopping 8.5 words.
Whether or not he is doing anything inappropriate, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that it's worth being looked at. But that's all I'll say. There's a lot of ways. All right.
Okay. Boy, I sure do enjoy awkward veiled threats from the President of the United States that take 2 years to follow through. Sure hope they last a lot longer than Jack Smith. Just goofy stuff. They're doing this so that if Trump comes in and his team throws out the lawsuit, they can say, collusion, Musk and Trump. And it is the most manufactured drama I have ever seen. Again, this would have happened like earlier on in the year, earlier on in 24, last year. Maybe they'd have a case, but 1 week before Trump took office, they sued him. And now he's totally conflicting. Oh, this was so real and totally not planned at all. So that takes us over to Representative Nancy Mace and Jasmine Crockett. So Representative Nancy Mace, who was like a pretty useful, great representative for all of 15 minutes on the Capitol Hill and the transgenders and in the same sex of the bathroom issue, and then went right to her head, and she proceeded to just get out there and get all up in arms again. And then you have Jasmine Crockett, who I have, I will say accurately suggested reminds me of the local crackhead that one might find outside a speedway, yelling at the sky. Here is Jasmine Crockett and Representative Nancy Mace getting ready to square up in the House of Representatives.
Think that
somebody's campaign coffers really are struggling right now. So she gonna keep saying trans so that people will feel threatened. And child, listen, I want y'all to tell me whether or
Do not call me a child. I am no child.
I want
Don't
to
even
find
start.
out
I am a grown
which
woman.
of those
I am 47 years
emails
old. I have broken
actually
more
have
glass ceilings than you
Chairman,
ever
I am
will.
reclaiming my
Let's go.
time.
You will not do that. I am not a child.
I am reclaiming my time.
If you want to take it outside,
Mr. Chairman, the committee is not in order.
Order.
Point of order. Point of order.
Order.
So I'm amazed that either of those two draw a salary, considering that right now federal dollars don't typically go to preschool programs. But, you know, if we move slightly aside from that, just a bit of a pro tip here, boys and girls. People say really nasty things about me all the time. And there are ways to eviscerate them in public that do not go, you want to take this outside? I had students that did that all the time. And are there times that getting into a fight is necessary? Yes, absolutely. Getting in a fight because someone called you a child has to be about the most ridiculous, nonsense, white trash behavior I have ever seen in my entire life. As someone who grew up in the hick part of Indiana and proudly spent his entire life doing hick things, I would like to remind everyone out there that white trash behavior is a very firm distinction, and that basically like meth trailer park distinction kind of stuff. In that part of the Midwestern town, I had students like, just beyond ridiculous. Oh, you called me a child, you want to fight? And then Jasmine Crockett criticizing someone about being a child. Jasmine Crockett is the last person on earth who should criticize anyone about anything whatsoever. Jasmine Crockett is just white trash of a behavior of a different color. It's ridiculous. I don't know why we ended up selecting just the most goober-filled Jerry Springer guests to the House of Representatives. But if we could have the squad and then the Nancy Mace crew of individuals get themselves together for just a minute and a half, you know who longer has precedence over that committee? Crockett. The Democrats don't run that committee anymore. So if she wants to yell and scream into the sky, let her. What's going to happen? Oh no, she called you a child. Yeah, she's not in power. Who cares? But here we are. Again, just goofy nonsense beyond all belief. So that brings us over to the Federal Emergency Management Agency in our second to last bit of quick news on the roundup here. That is, I've received a couple of reports about this and haven't had the time to look into it myself. But according to Senator Ted Budd, the senator's office reported this evening that he's hearing from dozens in Western North Carolina who have been, quote, kicked out of their hotels tonight despite FEMA's announcement yesterday that they were extending transitional sheltering assistance through January of 2025, end quote. He then says that it's unacceptable and it needs to be fixed this evening, which is correct. What bothers me about this particular situation is that this is not the first time that FEMA has done this kind of crap. When Tim Kennedy from the Daily Signal and I went to Maui right after the fires that scourged the island, we found FEMA kicking individuals who had just lost everything in those fires out of the Grand Wailea, which is the most expensive hotel on Maui, as well as several of the other nicest hotels on Maui to staff FEMA agents. Now what it looks like we have is FEMA possibly kicking individuals out in North Carolina. I mean, we've already had the incidents with FEMA only serving individuals who didn't have Trump signs in their yard as best practices in Florida. And of course, FEMA has been accused of all kinds of things up and down as far as North Carolina is concerned. I just have a bit of a question here. When Biden and his administration get out there and Senate Democrats get out there and say that it's totally disgusting and rude to possibly criticize FEMA, why is it? Because the evidence suggests that there is a widespread organizational problem in the federal bureaucracies. So if individuals have issues with the bloat of federal agencies and what they are doing to average everyday Americans, not just from the left, not from the right, but from the richest down to the lowest income class, have just as much a right to federal resources because they are taxpayers. And that instead of, giving millions and billions here, there, and everywhere over to Ukraine and over to Africa for migration study pattern nonsense, and to South America for all like for Paraguay for its border patrol inside Paraguay. Maybe we should spend a little bit of cash here on individuals in the FEMA realm of federal resources. Just kind of an idea there. I mean, I'm thinking that if I had constituents, that I would want them to think, even if you're on the blue side of the aisle, you're a Democrat on the Senate, which again, as we stated at the beginning of the show, the Senate largely exists for individuals to show why they could or couldn't be president. Because the Senate no longer serves the function it was meant to serve, which was being elected by state legislatures to represent the interests of the state. Now they're just like tier 1 House of Representatives members that have a larger district. We're in a weird position where if you're a Senate Democrat who wants to tell everyone, hey, I want to run for president, why would you not make any noise about FEMA screwing over individuals in Western North Carolina? Seems like North Carolina is kind of a big deal every time we get around the election year. As far as it being a possible swing state, wouldn't you want to, slide in and actually help an individual out? No. Well, people are getting really fed up with this outside of just the political realm because, according to the New York Post, this was around noon today, recall efforts against Governor Gavin Newsom are now underway in California because Governor Newsom completely mishandled the wildfires before, during, and after. So, I mean, will Californians actually band together and recall Gavin Newsom? Maybe. I mean, there is a decades-long system of apathy in the American public that completely ruins measures that were set up to correct and hold accountable the kind of garbage that always becomes prevalent in systems of power. And that because we haven't really had to worry about the political process in this country since arguably the end of World War II, but realistically since the end of the Cold War, just kind of let it go. Things will run their course. Let the people who care about politics care. Well, now that's no longer really the way that America is functioning. Now we're actually seeing a larger group of people in the country who are actively involved in politics. Mark Zuckerberg made this case very clear in lifting a specific part of the algorithmic censorship in Instagram and Facebook via the Meta Business and the Meta Functional platforms that had previously restricted political content from showing up on average everyday Americans' feeds. Now he says, well, actually, it looks like a lot of people are interested in political content. Yes, they cannot afford groceries. They're being kicked out of hotels after natural disasters. The most basic functions they are paying for with their taxes are not actually being provided to them via services. So, yeah, I mean, I would say that it would absolutely be necessary to make sure that Americans are able to see what it is that they are searching for. And this is going to be, at least according to the trending data that we have right now, this could obviously change. I certainly hope it doesn't. What we're seeing right now is a growing trend of Americans who, after they spend all day at work, while they're at work, in the morning and the evening, are paying attention to the political culture of this country and what is done and what isn't being done. And that is a very, very serious problem for three groups of people. Number one, it's a very serious problem for third-party individuals who only ever screech both sides bad and don't actually do anything to reform either party. Because just screeching both sides bad is not helpful, doesn't actually move anything forward, and people realize pretty quickly that it's kind of a resource drain on what could be useful conversations or humiliations, given what issue we're talking about. Number two, people are getting really, really, really tired of the establishment members of both parties who like to get up in meetings and yell about things that they themselves are participating in as soon as the hearing is over. And number three, people are kind of starting to pay attention and are getting really tired of this kind of bait and switch rug pull media strategy stuff where a natural disaster happens and Gavin Newsom comes out and goes, this is all due to Donald Trump. It's like, first of all, dude hasn't been president the last 4 years, at least as far as I remember. And number two, you're the governor who we have all of this detailed information has done all of these things to make a wildfire or an arsonist started fire, if it occurs, far worse. It's just not working anymore. By the way, you're going to see the same thing with Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, in which if there is a hostage deal that is brokered, because again, Trump has made the threat, if the Hamas hostage situation in which there are American citizens still being held by Hamas, if that is not resolved by the time that I have taken office, then all hell will break loose. Those are his words. And now you see a deal that is in the process of being made, according to the Israeli government, according to intelligence sources, according to secondary and tertiary partners, intermediaries in the region. And so now what you're going to see is likely probably the last couple of days before Trump takes office, you're going to see the hostage deal go through, if it does, and then the Democrats are going to try to take, all of the credit for it. They're going to say, see, this is Biden. Look at how amazing this is. People ain't going to fall for it. I'm sorry. It had been made very clear what the standards were and what the red lines were. And in the Joe Biden administration, like the Obama administration from which he got a lot of his policies, all of Joe Biden's red lines were like really thin dotted lines that were exceptionally porous. And so after Biden flunked in Afghanistan, Putin invaded into Ukraine and caused a series of international events that cost Americans lives, that cost Americans their freedom in the realm of the hostages, not just in Hamas, but also in places like Russia, and have cost Americans a serious amount of resources, freedoms, and properties. And you're finding out that now voters are starting to get a little bit more of a memory. That's a serious problem for those who are trying to do the old bait and switch rug pull that's just not working as well as it used to. All right, we'll be back with a little bit more tomorrow to talk about some of the other updating news that is unfortunately just breaking far too fast for us to cover in one evening. Make sure to tune in on January the 20th at 10:30 a.m. We're going to be doing a great recap of the Trump return to prominence and then his re-election, the best political comeback story in American history by far. We're going to talk about what we can expect ahead with some special guests. And then, of course, the inauguration itself. Don't miss it. We're looking forward to seeing you there. I'm Tony Kinnett. This has been the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and first on 93 WIBC. Take care.